Hello everyone, you're very welcome to the third in the Talking Towns seminar series, and it's brought to you by the Centre for Irish Towns in UCD. And CFIT was co-founded by Orla Murphy and Philip Crowe to bring together researchers and stakeholders from across the island of Ireland to support the revitalisation of Irish towns. One of the key aims within that was building a network of people both within UCD and outside of UCD. And this seminar series is one of the ways in which we hope to connect people and connect the dots between the different research areas. So my name is Sarah Cottrell and I will be chairing today's webinar. I'm a lecturer in the School of Civil Engineering and a member of CFIT's working group, and I've been curating the seminar series with Katrina Devery, and I'd really like to thank her for all of her work in making this come to fruition and bringing the speakers together and making sure everyone's able to attend today. So the webinars take place on the first Thursday of every month. So this will be the last one of the calendar year, and then we'll pick back up with more town-based conversation in the spring term. So each webinar has a different theme, and today's focus is on the just transition in towns. So we'll have two fantastic talks for you today, and we'll hear from each of the speakers and then open up for discussion at the end once both of them have had a chance to speak. So if you can put any comments or questions that you have throughout their talks in the chat, and preferably as well the name of the person that the question is for, then we can pick those up at the end, and we'll try and get through as many Q&As that we can. If your question is to both speakers, then don't feel like you need to put a name on that, but it just means we can focus the questions a little bit more if there's a name there. The final thing to say before introducing our first speaker is that this is being recorded and it will be posted up onto the Centre for Irish Towns YouTube channel in due course, and we'll put the link to that in the chat function. If you've missed any of the previous Talking Town webinars, then you can use that link to catch up on them there. The first talk is from Dr. Aparajita Banerjee, who is a postdoctoral researcher in the College of Business in UCD and a member of the CFIT working group. And her research explores the impacts of low energy transition developments in the Irish Midlands. So things like the closure of the Bord na Móna peat extraction business, and the development of wind farms in the region on local communities, and how these developments affect community members' socioeconomic conditions, their relations with the local landscape, their sense of place, and their perspective of just transition to a sustainable future. So Aparajita's talk today will focus on just transitions and the future of small towns in Irish Midlands.
I'll share my screen. So can you see my screen? Okay.
Yep, perfect.
Yeah, okay. So, yeah. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending this session of the Talking Towns. Thank you, Sarah and Katrina, for arranging this session on just transitions. The title of my presentation today is Just Transitions and Future of Small Towns in Irish Midlands. My colleague, Dr. Skitema, and I have been engaged in this research in understanding the implications of a just transition in the Irish Midlands since the end of 2019, and we are studying the socio-economic impacts of energy policies on rural communities. Today, I will be sharing some of our findings with you all. But before I begin, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the community members and people who have participated in this research for their time, cooperation, and their valuable inputs. So it is perhaps now common knowledge that to address the threat of anthropogenic climate change, it is critical that we reduce our CO2 emissions. So this means that there needs to be two main supply side adjustments in the energy sector. One is to reduce the use of fossil fuels for energy production. And also the other one is to increase energy produced from renewables. Ireland has also set plans to reduce around 70% of, Ireland has plans to produce 70% of its energy from renewable sources by the year 2030. So the shift from fossil fuels to renewables would require complicated social and technological changes. These changes would also have profound societal impacts. For example, some changes in the Irish energy sector and its implications are already taking place as we speak. In 2019, 2 thermal power plants which were using peat which is a type of fossil fuel in a very crude form, was closed in the Irish Midland region. So when Bodamona, which is the peat producing company, it lost its main customer in the ESB thermal power plants, they also stopped their peat extraction for fuel business. Though this resulted in it has a positive result, and it reduced the use of fossil fuels in electricity production in Ireland, the closure of the peat industry also led to around 4,000 estimated direct job loss, which is like direct job loss and indirect job losses in the area. There were also some other impacts, which like energy shortage in the short run, out-migration, reduction of small like tax base in small towns. There are also talks about shrinking of local services like schools, police, transportation, etc. On the other hand, the closure of the bogs of the peatlands created a unique opportunity for Bodamona to pursue their renewable energy plans. The same bogs which were providing peat to the thermal power plants now can be easily converted into large wind farms. These wind farms are built using state-of-the-art technology. As a result, the wind turbines have become greater in height, and they have become more efficient. The technology has also become more resilient to different climatic conditions, and they have also become digitalized, and it requires less maintenance and fewer workers for operation. So what we are seeing is that in the same area, which is the Irish Midlands, there is a shift from a highly manual intensive labor extraction, manual labor intensive peat extraction business to a very sophisticated, digitally operated kind of energy production. There is a shift from manual to very highly digitalized and technical form of energy production. So therefore, these changes come with their own socio-economic and environmental impacts. Socio-economic impacts would include loss of jobs in Bodamona, loss of jobs in businesses which were supplying to Bodamona. There are also other impacts on local communities, like the loss of business from Bodamona workers. There is also low footfall in the area. There are less economic activities, like any visit in the Irish Midlands would show that a number of shops are closed in the main street. There is also a large number of pubs or gathering places in the Midland areas are also closed down. And these pubs were the places where people traditionally met with each other and they had chats with each other. So what we are seeing that is these changes are not just the socio-economic changes, there are broad psychosocial and cultural changes which are happening in the area. There are also, along with the socio-economic changes, there are also changes in the landscape. Peat landscape, which was around these small towns in the Midlands, which often provided the community members with a sense of wilderness. People use those peatlands for walks, and they like to spend time in nature by visiting these bogs. However, some of these landscapes are also seeing changes, and they are being converted into large wind farms. So the open bogs are now kind of covered with wind turbines, which has kind of a mixed impact on communities' relationship with their nature. So scholars often term areas where such rapid industrial changes takes place, that as we are seeing in the Midlands, as sacrifice zones, or zones where rapid industrial activities are taking place. One of the key characteristic feature of a sacrifice zone is that there will be a range of socio-economic inequalities in this area. So So however, when we are talking about transition to a low carbon future, it cannot be achieved without justice, or an unjust transition cannot be sustainable. So in other words, having or creating sacrifice zones with socioeconomic inequalities cannot be sustainable in the long run. As a result, the European Union and the government of Ireland has allocated special pots of money for the Irish Midlands, and this fund is called the National Just Transition Funds. The purpose of this fund is to fund projects that would retrain workers and generate sustainable green enterprises in the wider Midlands region. With these programs, there is a hope that a just transition will be achieved in the Irish Midlands. However, as academic scholars, we argue that in order to achieve a just transition, we have to understand what is a just transition. Is it a term that can be co-opted, or is there a theoretical basis to this term? There are multiple ways just transition can be understood. The roots of the concept of the term just transition lies in the US labor movement. Strong environmental regulations during the 1970s in the US led to a deep impact on the labor force, especially workers who were working in the chemical industries. The labor unions advocated that as changes in the environmental policies affected workers, environmental policies should also be considering the justice angle for the workers. So at the core of the idea of just transition is the idea of justice and the idea of human well-being. When we look at the theoretical side of just transition, we argue that just transition should be based on tenets of justice, like restorative justice, distributive justice, and procedural justice. There are other forms of justice as well, like recognition justice, a cosmopolitan justice, but we focus on these three elements of justice. Just transition can also be a governance strategy as well. For example, sustainability-oriented policies are often promoted by the government, but they may not result in just and equal results for all. For example, emission reduction policies can often conflict with poverty alleviation policies. They can create inequalities, they can create unemployment, they can have differential impacts on regional development. Therefore, as a government strategy, just transition can be understood as a government strategy as well. Just transition is a part of public perception as well. Public perception of the acceptance and rejection of the local development should be also a part of the just transition understanding. What the government may think as just may not always necessarily be perceived as a just by the local people. So we see that there are at least 3 or 4 types of different ways of understanding the idea of just transition. So given this literature, we were interested in understanding how the changes or the closure of Bordamona peat extraction industry, sorry, my dog, okay. Industry, okay, sorry for that. Given this literature, we were interested in understanding how this changes the closure of the Bordamona industry and the new wind farms that are coming up in the Irish Midlands are perceived by the local people who have lived in this area, they work in this area, and they have been raising their families in this area for generations. What we did. So in our research to understand the community perception, we collected data using both qualitative and quantitative methods. We conducted door-to-door surveys in the community. We did semi-structured interviews with community leaders, Bordamona workers, trade union members, and people living close to proposed wind farms. We also collected data through participant observations. We attended election rallies. We attended public conferences on just transitions in the Midlands. We also tracked social media posts and newspaper articles on the topic of just transition in the last 2-3 years. So now I will talk a little bit about our findings. We found that though government funding was put in place under the Just Transition Fund, there are very mixed evidences of justice and injustice in the Irish Midlands. For example, distributive injustice was evident. Not all stakeholder concerns were addressed. For example, pensioners were apprehensive about their future pensions. Some workers also reported that the training programs were not tailor-made according to their needs. Local jobs were also not available, especially those aligning with the new and the old skills learned by the Bodamona workers. Some participants also reported that they will either have to migrate to urban centers or commute daily for jobs. Older Bodamona workers were also apprehensive of the competitive nature of the job market now. They feared that the nature of the jobs available these days have changed, and their skills were in the peat extraction business that has now become redundant. Overall, we found participants were apprehensive about their future and the future of the region. We also found very mixed responses of procedural justice in how participants perceived the current just transition plans. For example, most workers knew that the heydays of peat were over for a long time. So they all knew that it was coming. Yet for them, the closure decision was very sudden. There were no steps taken to ensure that a plan was in place beforehand. A just transition plan was in place beforehand. As a result, there was no wide-scale, intense, and repetitive consultation with workers and community members. There was a lack of social dialoguing and consultation, and that made the participants feel that they did not have adequate and timely information, and that aggravated their sense of uncertainty. Overall, our results suggest that the procedural justice components were gravely missing in the whole just transition planning. In other words, the current just transition plan follows a very top-down approach without much inputs from the workers and the community members who would be affected by the closure of the peat industry in the region. We also found that the people in the community were apprehensive of the green jobs and their ability to meet the challenges of unemployment in the region caused specifically due to the closure of the Bodamona activities. People were also apprehensive that the funds allocated would not benefit the workers who lost their jobs or the communities affected by the closure of the local businesses. There were also conflicts with land use changes. Local people who were living close to the communities, living in the communities around the bogs, often resisted the conversion of the peatlands into wind farms. There were also apprehensions about the lack of government focus on a just transition for the region. So the participants were frustrated that there was no government task force created specifically to address the needs of the region, and that would continue over a period of time. So there was initially a task force, but they didn't know what happened to it over a period of time. So to quote one interviewee, I would have very little faith in the just transition, to be honest. That's my honest opinion. The just transition is really a political thing. It's politicized and it's all a game. It's my honest opinion. Politicians don't want negative PR, and it's about sound bites. It's sound bites for the politicians to cover up these little happenings at the moment until it's done and dusted. I guarantee you that just transition will be a bygone word here in about 2 years or 3 years' time. So to conclude, based on our research, we saw that ensuring distributed, procedural, and restorative justice components are essential in just transition planning. Contingency plans should be preemptively developed continuously so that climate impacting industries or those industries which has high greenhouse gas emissions are better prepared for sudden changes in decisions or policy decisions. Just transition should always guarantee justice for the workers. That should be at the core of just transition planning. Just transition planning should also use fair and just procedures, as transparency is key to just transition. Just transition planning also should have a top-down and a bottom-up approach so that there is community participation in the just transition planning. Rural communities that host energy projects should not be neglected in just transition discourses. Just transition planning should be in the long term and should start long before the any decision of closure is taken. We think that a leave no one behind policy, which is a UN SDG policy goal, should be used in just transition planning, so that the policies which emerge from just transition should have regenerative rural development at its core, and these policies should be based on equality, fairness, participatory democracy, reciprocity, and respect. So thank you very much for attending this talk, and please let me know if you have any questions. You can also contact me for further details at aparajita.banerjee@ucd.ie. Thank you.
Thanks, Aparajita. And I just want to encourage anyone, if you have any questions for Aparajita, we'll take these at the end after we've heard Sean's presentation. So if you can just drop them in the chat function now. They don't have to be long or lengthy. We just want to hear your questions. So if you can put those in the chat function, then we'll try and get through as many of them as we can at the end. I thought it was a really interesting talk about how people and landscapes can be negatively affected by policy change that can come in that's supposing to be bringing around a positive change, and the real importance of the kind of early planning and engagement, the need to build trust around that. So we're going to move on to our next speaker, and then we'll come back with some questions. The next talk is from Sean McCabe. Sean is Executive Manager at TASC Climate Justice Centre. So TASC is a think tank for action on social change. Sean's work at TASC has focused on developing a participative decision-making model called the People's Transition, and that views climate action as an enabler of local development. It gives people and communities ownership of the transition to zero carbon societies, and it enhances public support for a just transition by tackling inequality and raising standards of living through the delivery of climate solutions. So he's going to talk to us today about some of the pilot projects of the People's Transition Model, which has been rolled out in Ardara in Donegal and Phibsborough in Dublin. And these are two very different communities facing very different challenges when it comes to realising a fair and equitable transition. So I'll hand over to Sean now to give his presentation.
Mute. Thank you very much, Sarah. Contrary to what I said when I logged onto this call, I am actually going to try to share my screen, and I'll just chat a little bit while I do that, because I'm on my phone because I poured a cup of coffee over my laptop during COP and now it doesn't work properly. So 2 seconds, if you don't mind, while I'm doing this messing up. Okay, can you see that? Sorry.
We can.
Yeah, perfect.
Brilliant.
Thanks.
All right, sorry about that, folks. So the People's Transition, I think this will complement, hopefully it will complement Ms. Banerjee's presentation, because I think what we've learned from the Irish experience of the Just Transition is very much in keeping with what that interviewee said. There's not much trust in it because it hasn't ever been demonstrated that there is a commitment to protect the workers and those communities who will be most impacted by the transition that we're facing. The People's Transition came about because I guess it is quite important to think about the words that we use, and the Just Transition does originate from the work of the trade union movement. It has very specific pillars related to social dialogue and ensuring, that there's the correct procedural mechanisms in place so that workers do not get stranded as we move away from fossil fuels. So we coined the term the people's transition in order to offer a sense of the just and equitable transition that the broader community is now facing, or the transition that we're facing, and how we might make it just and equitable. So quickly, I'll just talk a little bit about the background of the people's transition, something on community wealth building for climate action, which is the basis upon which the people's transition is built, and then a little bit about the pilot projects which we have been conducting in Ardra and Phibsborough. So quickly, just the objectives and methodology of this project. The rationale behind the people's transition is as follows. Climate action will have to happen on a timescale that is much faster than the time necessary to build the social approval that politicians ideally need to undertake radical social change, if they ever have. So essentially, what we're talking about here is a situation where the climate action that we do take, in order for it to be successful, must proactively build the support that it will benefit from. And to do this, then it has to focus on positive local development outcomes rather than top-down instrumentalization of community or instrumentalization of those groups that would be the forerunners in any sort of participative approaches at the community level. So on the right-hand side here, you see the virtuous circle that the people's transition is trying to build. It's on a basis of participation and the valuing of local knowledge, and then the co-creation and, importantly, the co-ownership of the assets of climate action. So if you start at the top, the community is engaged from the get-go as an implementing partner on local climate action. The climate action is seen to address the priorities and local needs of that community, so that the community's capabilities are expanded and their standards of living enhanced through the delivery of climate action, which in turn will increase trust and increase demand, and may just get us on the type of trajectory of community-led climate action that is necessary to save us all from the very unpleasant future that awaits us if we don't change. And some of you are probably aware of community wealth building approaches, which have been pioneered in Preston in the UK, or in Cincinnati, or in other places around the world. In fact, CLES, the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, is currently working with Dublin City Council, I believe, on issues of community wealth building for Dublin. The idea of community wealth building is quite straightforward. You have these anchor institutions, municipal buildings, municipal operations that exist within a city or a town, and they create a demand for goods and services, which they direct that demand towards local cooperatives and local wealth building operations. And those wealth building cooperatives are in turn supported by not-for-profit corporations. If you think about it in the Irish case, that could be local development companies or indeed even credit unions, which in turn are supported by municipal government. The advantage of this approach is that, of course, you're creating local jobs, you're keeping the wealth that is generated by public procurement, you're keeping that circulating in the economy. And where it has been pioneered, particularly in Preston, you've seen quite substantial positive outcomes. Of course, this whole model is contingent on what are called community wealth builders, anchor institutions like schools or hospitals or universities that have an influenceable spend. And that spend is then used to procure locally to certain environmental or labor standards, and that is what rises the tide. And it, the progressive procurement model, Senator Alice Mary Higgins currently is working on a bill to advance progressive procurement in Ireland. We've got quite a conservative view of our conservative interpretation in Ireland of the European procurement guidelines, which inhibits some of this strategic community wealth building approaches. So it would be good if we were to culturally lighten up a little bit in terms of how we interpret the European guidelines, but B, create this sort of value for money or quality balance, so that you're not just looking for the best financial offer in terms of a tender, but you're also considering social and environmental dimensions when you're looking at procurement. So there's a lot of community wealth building opportunities in any supply chain, feeding elements of that supply chain through non-profit development companies or community land trusts, cooperatives, and looking at things like transit-oriented development or the incubation of social enterprises. Importantly, this is looking at, I suppose, both the social foundation and the environmental ceiling described by Kate Raworth's donut economics model. And the key quote that I've pulled out here is that you are taking an intentional approach to the distribution of economic opportunity. And I think this, in terms of regionally balanced development and community wealth building, is very important, because ultimately the climate transition is going to be the single largest investment this country has ever made, or that any country has ever made, if we're to do it correctly. And how we spend that investment is very important. The problem with rural communities is that typically you don't have a large density of so-called anchor institutions, right? So the kind of hospitals or universities, then you don't have very many in smaller rural areas. So we have to get a bit creative in terms of what might serve as an anchor institution. And I think climate action itself can serve as that temporary anchor institution. It's just to give you an example, in Fintry in Scotland, a community opposed the installation of wind turbines for the generation of renewable energy because they felt it would impact negatively on their community. And when they did, the company who were establishing the wind farm offered everyone in the village a sum of money sort of to buy them off, and they refused. But they did think, God, if this company can afford to pay us all that much, I wonder what the turbines themselves are worth. So rather than taking the cash payment, they asked for one of the 15 turbines. And after a protracted negotiation process, they got that. Now, Fintry in Scotland, once all debts are paid off on that wind turbine, which I believe will be in the middle of 2022, they will start receiving about $500,000 a year into the community from that turbine, which you can imagine what $500,000 a year for a relatively small town or village could do in terms of accelerating local development outcomes. So if we think about this as not an accurate interpretation of a climate action supply chain, but it is an effort to try to think of, what could we do in terms of identifying opportunities within the climate action supply chain in Ireland, identifying how we would distribute them around the country to boost regional development, and then identify opportunities where not only can these supply chain elements exist within communities, but they can actually be owned by communities through cooperatives or community businesses or social enterprises, so that you're really intentionally sharing the benefits and burdens of climate action, and that's the heart of climate justice. So this is the efforts that we've tried to undertake through the People's Transition. The outcome of the People's Transition was to build a community blueprint for 1, 2, or 3 community wealth building approaches to climate action in the communities that we were working in. And we hope that the efforts wouldn't duplicate existing action, but instead would be complementary, holistic, costed, and implementable, sort of shovel ready. Now, that might have been a little bit ambitious because we've only given ourselves 7 months to get to this point. But there's a reason why we only gave ourselves 7 months. The climate crisis is so great that if we're not moving at that sort of pace, we're goosed. So the challenges we've come up against have been many, but we have got to a relatively good outcome point. And the final reports, I spent the morning drafting the second one. We're hoping they will be out in the next couple of weeks. So just the projects themselves, I'll step through each community individually. Very interesting because the two communities are obviously very different. Ardra, Donegal is a small community of about 2,000 people in the wider hinterland on the west coast, and obviously very agriculturally dependent on tourism. Phibsborough, very different kettle of fish. Depending on where you draw the boundaries, you're looking at maybe 10 to 12,000 people. Not the same sense of community, but although very strong pockets of community all over the area, but quite a different conceptualization, I guess, of community, and a lot of hidden issues. Now, there's hidden issues in both areas, hidden poverty in both, etc. But I think more so and more plentiful in Phibsborough. So we'll start with Phibsborough. This is a mapping, if you want, or an infographic of the project. There were 3 phases, as you can see there. The first phase was a mapping phase. We didn't talk to anyone in the community. We just looked at the data. We pulled on census data or any other data we could get our hands on for the area, and it was able to then teach us who to look out for in terms of who to listen to, because oftentimes we can listen to the same voices over and over again, and if we don't endeavor to learn the experiences of maybe the marginalized people within our communities, we will probably recreate the class assumptions that have marginalized them in the first place. And then the solutions phase was taking what we had heard from the community and trying to understand, well, how can we build climate action projects that address at least some of the needs and priorities of the community. So quickly on Phibsborough, what we learned, a synopsis of what we learned from the mapping phase, was that the majority of people were renters, right? And as they'll tell you, I'm a renter myself, but you know, it's very hard to be part of a community if at any stage you can be put out of where you're living. That's a very big issue. So if more than 50% of your community are renters, it was very important that we heard from them. We also knew that there, you know, the surveys, the data confirmed what we had already expected about diversity. Large number of new Irish communities who maybe don't feel as connected to the area. Pockets of some pretty pervasive unemployment, and actually one street in particular had an incredible rate of about 80% of the tenants were single mothers. You also have a relatively young population. We had a high concentration of potential anchor institutions, the Mater Hospital, Mountjoy, Dalymount, Bohemians Football Club. So there was quite an interesting mapping phase, which allowed us to then target who we would listen to. Not that everyone's voice isn't important, but we weighted our listening to try to include those more marginalized voices. And I don't know how well this is displaying on your screens, but just some of the issues that we heard was obviously a lot of concern about the raising costs of rent and mixed standard upkeep in rental properties. But also, you know, we were talking to older people about retrofitting. They couldn't really understand the benefits, particularly if the savings they were meant to gain from retrofitting their house ran beyond their life expectancy. That was a bit of an issue. Access to education and training was something that the community prized. And then there were other issues like precarity for renters, or a real frustration at developer-led development in the area, and the fact that the community had kind of fallen between two local development partnership areas and maybe was underserved as a result. So the issues in blue here were the ones we felt, well, maybe there's opportunities to try to tackle some of these through climate action. The grayer ones we felt would benefit from the community wealth building elements of climate action, but maybe not directly from the climate actions themselves. And so the two solutions that we're proposing for Phibsborough, the first is a retrofitting cooperative, which would be community owned and community led, and would look to both train young people in the area and existing workers in the area up as retrofitting professionals, would try to link in with the anchor institutions in order to provide advanced demand, so that the training that's necessary to upskill the workers would be available. We also looked at its role as a broker or a facilitator, particularly in the dialogue that's necessary between landlords and tenants, because nobody is really paying any attention to the fact that we have a huge amount of rented property that mostly is very, very poor in terms of insulation. And also there's no incentive for the landlord to retrofit. And if the landlord does retrofit, the only incentive that does exist would be the increasing of rent. So what that will do in terms of renter precarity is pretty concerning. We've already seen in Germany and other places significant green gentrification, where communities are being further marginalized through the rollout of climate action. So that was the renters cooperative. The second option that we were proposing is a delivery bike cooperative. So about 20% of all delivery emissions come from the last mile, and a lot of the time last mile delivery could be broken down and distributed by cargo bike. Obviously as well, we're seeing, you know, some of the most precarious work in the city are delivery bike couriers who face some pretty unsavory treatment by the companies that they work for. So a worker-owned bike cooperative has huge potential. They're springing up in different parts of the world, and leading one out in Phibsborough and Dublin, I think, would be a good idea. That's Phibsborough. Quickly onto our DRA. I'm sorry, I've been talking for a while now, so I'll try to wrap it up quickly. Our DRA, we had the same process: a mapping, a listening, and then a solutions phase. The mapping phase found that in this day and age, which is kind of remarkable, 18% of the population still had no internet access. The area suffered from quite pervasive out-migration, although the pandemic was somewhat reversing that trend, and you were seeing some pretty talented young people coming home who wanted to make their home in our DRA and wanted to work for the community. Proportion of people living with disability was quite significant, 15%, which meant there was also a lot of carers living in the area. And obviously care work is climate work, just to be clear on that. Also you had a large number of farmers and semi-skilled workers. Obviously farmers have a particular vulnerability in terms of the transition, but also a significant role to play if they're included correctly. The listening phase then, on the right hand side here, you see you had a desire for sustainable quality jobs in the area. There's a long history in our DRA of weaving and the production of cloths. So there was kind of a romance there, and it's important that we tie in the transition into the stories and the narratives of place, and very much so the self-reliance and resilience of those industries is something the community was very proud of. Big need for local apprenticeships and traineeships. A lot of people want to see better support for local farmers, and interestingly, there was a desire for a reboot of local democracy. Obviously, issues like MICA, the housing crisis issue in Donegal, and also the feeling of being abandoned by central government in terms of transport and other things, really made the community want to be more participative and drive their own agenda. Then obviously there were things that we couldn't deal with, like safer roads or better quality public transport. that was beyond our remit, but we did again hope that the community wealth building element of the project would flow into helping the community maybe take ownership of some of those issues themselves. So really quickly, the two solutions proposed. First is a biochar cooperative. Biochar is essentially taking biomass and charring it such that it will permanently remove carbon from the carbon cycle. Big sequestration potential, potential for environmental benefits because it has great, if you bury biochar, it improves soil quality. Some really interesting research emerging from Scotland, which seems to indicate that inoculating the roots of ash trees with biochar prevents ash dieback. So we could become self-sufficient in the manufacture of hurls again. And there's also, depending on how big the cooperative would be, there could be potential for community heat installations and the like. The second was a much bigger scale project, which would be a privately owned wind farm, but with a 30% profit share flowing to the local community. That could create up to 100 direct jobs. Sorry, did I say this? A seaweed farm, 100 direct jobs, 100 to 150 downstream jobs. Indigenous seaweed being used, which is, obviously linked into an environment where you're trying to improve fish stocks. So it could become a breeding ground for fish. It sequesters significant amounts of carbon per year. And the income for the community when this, it's enormous, it's 15 square kilometers. But when it was up and running, you'd be looking at potentially 5 million a year coming into the community. The community were, I think it's fair to say, quite suspicious of the proposal, the seaweed farm proposal, and were much keener to look into how they might cooperatively own a smaller seaweed farm rather than try to go big and take a smaller slice, if you know what I mean. So they're the two projects. I think I'll leave it there. There's a lot more that I could say, but I've probably gone well over my allotted time, and I know there'll be questions. So thank you for listening, and I'll hand it back to Sarah.
Thanks, Sean. That was a fantastic presentation, and I'm sure there's going to be lots of questions coming through on the chat now. Whilst that's happening, I think, first of all, it's kind of quite key to say that there were really excellent ties in that in terms of some of the issues that came up in the last webinar about how we ensure we hear from marginalised voices, but also how the people that we're engaging with, if we're talking to people, how we can make sure that those are still the same people at the end of the studies that we're doing. And the issue that you raised around renters is really key on that. Are we reflecting, are we representing the people that we've interviewed or we've engaged with early on? I'm going to start with a question to both of you, and it draws on things that you've both presented on. So in Aparajita's presentation, there was the quote from one of the interviewees, where they said that the just transition is a political thing, and there was almost this kind of negative connotation with the phrasing just transition. And then in the naming of the project in Sean's presentation, calling it the people's transition instead, it's almost a reframing. It's an identifying that the language we use can be a way that we can rebuild trust. So I kind of wanted to get your opinions on how do we undo that connotation of it being a political thing and rebuild the trust? Is it down to the language that we use? And also draw on a question that somebody had put in the chat asking, is it too late to do this right in Ireland? And if not, what steps by government, whether that's local or national, do you recommend?
Okay, I can go first. In terms of naming just transition, and I really like the term people transition. I personally really like terms like empathy-driven transition or something like that, like rather than just, because whenever we talk about the idea of just, it comes with a lot of, like, it is a loaded term. There is an expectation from everybody that justice will be key. I'm not saying that justice should not be key, but the thing is that whenever we term something just, there is an assumption that it is just. So even if it's not just, people would think that, okay, see, that person has said it is just, but it is not just. So the term just transition is very kind of, for me, it is a very difficult, it is a good term, but it's a difficult term, and it is open to interpretation by different groups, and they can interpret differently and set their expectations because of the interpretation in different ways. So I also like terms like increasing the capability or well-being of the community, those kind of actions, like terms, rather than just transition. And the second part of the question, whether it is too late for Ireland to do any, to achieve just transition or climate action, or in that sense, is, I don't know whether it's too late or too early, but I really know that I strongly believe that we cannot underestimate questions of socio-economic inequality and injustices while we're looking at climate actions. So climate action is good, it should be taken, but we also really need to also focus on how we can address issues like poverty, inequality, injustices, socioeconomic injustices. So climate action without those may not be an optimal solution. We should not drive those solutions blindly because we have to achieve the climate goals. It should go hand in hand. So if that takes time, it has to take time, because we are like thousands of years, we are seeing those injustices happening and nothing has been done to those injustices. So I think we should take that along with climate action. So that would be my take.
I might just jump in there. I'd agree completely. I think I like the term empathy-driven transition. I think it is important that just transition is political. And I think it's very important to recognize that all of this battle is political, because we've existed for about 30 years under a sort of neoliberal paradigm, which tells us that the private sector is the entity to solve all of our woes. And it really isn't, you know, and so much of the conversation now is about market-led approaches to deliver climate action, and even things like the carbon tax are very neoclassical in their framing, and ignore people living on the margins or people who are struggling. And so, you know, when we consider that the climate transition is not just shaping an energy sector or how we are, you know, it's actually an opportunity to reset the massive inequalities that have developed, whether that's through colonialism or whether it's, you know, all of the extractive processes, the extraction of labor that have happened since the Industrial Revolution. We have to, you know, at least call it for what it is. We can't just accept that we're going to take relatively scarce public finance and use it to create an enabling environment for private sector profit. So, you know, the political nature of the term just transition is important, and I think it's important that we look at things like the ILO guidelines which exist, and you know, Ireland learns from them and our decision makers implement them before they start using the term just transition to describe things that have absolutely nothing to do with just transition. So that's the just transition. But I do think then we need to expand our understanding of climate justice, whether that's within our own country or internationally, to make sure that we have an inclusive, fair and transition that distributes benefits and burdens. So that, I'd say that. Then in terms of, is it too late? Like, it's very late for the workers in the Midlands who've lost their jobs and haven't seen any meaningful replacement. It's, you know, all of these things, it comes down to who you're talking about. Is it too late for? You know, like, in a country as a whole, yeah, we could still probably, you know, avoid some real catastrophes like what's going to happen to the farming sector. How are we going to deal with the power dynamics that exist within that, and how's that going to play out over the next 10 or 15 years? But yeah, it's far too late for some people. It's far too late for communities who've lost their identity in the Midlands, you know, as workers' identity. And it's globally it's so late for so many people, and that's the key element, is that we have a historic responsibility and a level of wealth that determines that we should be leading the charge on this, and we really haven't been, and that has a much more detrimental effect in other parts of the world. So that'd be my sense on it.
Thanks, Sean. I think that, thinking about who are we talking about, who is this that we're representing, goes back to that point as well about making sure that we understand whose voices we're listening to within this. There was another question on here, I suppose kind of ties in with that a little bit, asking Aparajita whether there was any divergence in response across the various counties within the Midlands, or if you did receive a uniform response in the research that you did.
So I talked with people in County Offaly, County Longford. So those were the two areas I did my research. There was first and foremost a recognition that loss of Bodamona business in the counties were unequivocally, everybody agreed that it was a big loss to the community. So there was nobody, I don't remember talking to anybody who said that the loss was not massive, because these communities have been engaged in Bodamona for last 40, 50 years. So it is not like 10 years or 20 years. It's a historic part. It's a part of the community's identity. It's linked with the sense of place. Many people said we grew up hearing the sound of the locomotive engine taking peat from one part of the bogland to another part. So these are like the audiovisual sense of place as well, like how we think about a place. So I would say mostly people agreed that the loss of Bodamona business was a loss for the community. So there was no kind of divergent views. Yes, there were views in terms of like, oh, we would not miss the stacks of the thermal power plant, or oh, we would not miss the black suits coming out from the peat extraction business. So those were the fringe topics which were discussed, but fundamentally people all agreed that they are at a loss. And these jobs which we are talking about were very stable jobs. So people who joined Bodamona joined at the age of 16, and they worked through their entire lives. So at the age of 60, 65, they retired from those jobs. So their entire life was actually around this Bodamona job. So they didn't know anything else in what to do. And most were some people had some farming activities on the side, but mostly they were very much Bodamona workers, and that was the main identity. So so there was no kind of other views. Yeah.
Hey, we're getting towards the end, but I'm going to just put one question out to both of you now. It actually came in for Aparajita, but I think we can apply it a little bit more broadly, which is thinking about internationally, whether you've come across successful examples where just transition or community-led climate action has been implemented. I know, Sean, you gave a couple of examples of community wealth building internationally, but whether you've got a couple of examples, just kind of a quick fire round, and whether we can learn from those to apply here in Ireland.
Yeah, if I can go first, there are some examples emerging for like fossil fuel to non-fossil fuel kind of future is from Germany as well as in Australia, the Hunter Valley in Australia. There are a few cases. The key point which these cases are following is that they do a lot of consultation with the local communities. The government has task force created for that, and they have representative from the community in those task force. So consultation is key, social dialoguing is key. So that can be one of the way out. Public participation, as Sean has said, like that is also another key element of just transition.
Not to be negative, but I think there's lots of really strong bad examples of transition. And like if you look at the Thatcher era changes around coal in the UK, and then you trace it forward to Brexit, and you map it onto who voted for Brexit, you get a sense of how this isn't just issue for the here now, and like Aprijit has said there about sacrifice zones. Like it's a mad language to be using when you trace it forward in time and you realize that actually it's our democratic sustainability that's at stake here. Particularly once you move into the area of changing the livelihoods of farmers in Ireland. That's a particularly stark one. There is some really positive examples of community-led climate action through what's called the community-led local development multi-fund approach of the European Union. Some brilliant work even on social housing, environmental projects in Lisbon in Portugal, being enabled through Eco Boa Vista, it's called, being enabled through the community-led local development approach. Now, the problem in Ireland is that we haven't opted into that modality for receipt of European funding. So our funding comes in and is distributed like it's all centralized, whereas aside from the LEADER program. Now, the LEADER program in Ireland was incredibly successful at enabling communities to realize their agency in these types of projects. But people, commentators on it would reckon that it got shut down because local politicians aren't that fond of when people can actually fix their own potholes, So there was a certain element of community agency that was resisted through the LEADER program, and it has gotten subsequently weaker and weaker and weaker. We were very good at it in 1990, and we're not very good at it at all now. So looking at the community-led development multi-fund approach is the next step on from LEADER. Many European countries are embracing it, and it enables everything from the Just Transition Fund to just all access to all of the structural funding. A component of that is accessible to communities for community-led approaches, and I think it would be a no-brainer to opt into it now. I believe it's too late for this cycle of funding, and we have to wait till 2027. But they're the type of thing that can be real game changers. I think we're just culturally a little bit resistant in this country.
Thanks for that. I think it's great to present both the positive and the negative examples to be able to learn from both. There's still some questions coming in, but I've noticed that we have just gone past the hour. So I'd just like to thank both of our speakers. I think you both gave really clear, engaging presentations, and thanks everyone for the questions that you put into the chat. This is the last Talking Towns of this year, but we hope that we will see you for the next flush of webinars that we will have in the new year. So thanks again, everyone, for participating.
Thank you. Thank you very much.